Good evening. This is Mae Brussell on KAZU FM in Pacific Grove, California. It's broadcast number 674, November the 5th, 1984. The elections will have come and gone by the time most of you receive this broadcast, copies of this broadcast, and I'm not discouraged by the fact that Ronald Reagan could win the election again. All I have to do is look around and see the way people accept so little out of their lives that he's the appropriate leader for what people really expect of themselves and of their own country. Leslie Stahl was on CBS this morning discussing the role of the news media and the campaign of 1984, and she said that she did one news report on Reagan standing in a polluted area that was very much in need of being cleaned up, and the environmentalists were attacking him. And he goes out there and acts as if he's in favor of the cleaning up and the environment. And this piece that she wrote was very contradictory of his policies, and she was sure she'd never be allowed in the White House or with the press corps again. Much to her surprise, the White House spokesman, one of them, Larry Speaks, or another one, called her up and said, "That was a great bit of reporting you did yesterday. It's wonderful." And she said, "What do you mean? Aren't you angry?" He said, "Of course not." He said, "Nobody cares what you say." He said, "They just see the president out there so that it doesn't matter what you write or do. They have an image, and we give them that image." And she was saying that in some respects, the media wasn't negligent, but she's just one of the few that did even have a small piece of criticism of the president during this entire campaign. If prostitution ever became illegal in this country, they'd have to lock up all the TV reporters and announcers and poll takers and send them off to jail. People like Marvin Kalb and David Hartman and all of them. I don't have to run it down. This is a society that has given away its rights. It's had every chance to protect them, and it actually delivers them over to the masters very obediently. That is the theme of the plays of Samuel Beckett on slave and master, and that the slave needs his master as much as the master needs the slave. And it's a relationship between the two that has always existed and always will. And the few of us that are on the outside of it fighting to expose these various truths and separate them from lies must communicate with other people, and only those people who also want to know the truth. It's very destructive to sit and worry about what other people are thinking or doing. We must stay with those who go forward and make some kind of a wedge, small or otherwise, it doesn't matter, in trying to criticize the overt lies that are being put on us to control our minds, our society, planet Earth, space stations, and so forth. You have to be ever vigilant, and it doesn't end with any single election. Whether the Democrats or Republicans won, you'd have to be just as vigilant. And my work won't stop because Ronald Reagan is in, and it will stay at the same pace as it always has. I'm going to talk about the murder of Mrs. Gandhi, and I may take a long route. It may take 55 minutes to build up just to her assassination, but it may be shorter than that. We'll get on to the murder of Mrs. Gandhi. It's a difficult subject, and I don't want to offend any particular people, the Sikhs or the Hindus, in this matter, but just express my views based upon what our government has done in the past and what it appears they have done one more time. The United States is an active participant in divisiveness of every factor. So when you get Muslims, Hindu, Sikh, and other factors, they are great at playing those against each other, and this was part of a large plan that Adolf Hitler spelled out when he was planning the 1,000-Year Reich. The United States is not interested in development of third world or poor or social or economic stability. You should be recognizing that by now. And this is a country that needs that kind of care and attention. The United States punishes people and countries who don't obey when they're told to take orders from the Pentagon. And we've seen that over and over again. And Mrs. Gandhi was not obeying George Bush or Ronald Reagan, and she refused to take orders from the Pentagon. The United States has a history of taking over democratically elected countries. They don't give a bean about that, and they put in fascist dictatorships in replace of those elections whenever they can have a chance, and then those are almost impossible to overthrow. Greece did overthrow their military dictatorship, but very few countries are able to do such a thing. Mrs. Gandhi didn't trust Ronald Reagan's administration. She didn't trust George Bush, and she spoke about that, and she had reason not to, and of course they didn't want her vocalizing that too much. The United States Army has been arming Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh. We want to control the sea over there, the ports, to put atomic weapons and warheads, and she opposed that and felt that they were infringing upon their territory, whereas the United States intends to cover everything from Japan over to the Middle East and around the world and make a net around the world for their eventual war against the Soviet Union. And George Bush tried to make a deal with Mrs. Gandhi that if she would go against the Soviet Union and attack the entry into Afghanistan, then they would be more kind to her, while they, meantime, were giving all these weapons and airplanes to Pakistan, and she wouldn't go along with that. She wasn't a perfect lady. Whoever advised her to go into the holy temple of the Sikhs, whoever gave her that advice, was her enemy, not her friend. And that is where the trouble began. They set her up for the kill because it would follow that if you broke this chanting that has been going on for hundreds of years, anyone who did that would automatically be killed. So if you could get her to attack the area, to set up a provocation, you could almost deliver India to the United States, because you would have a confused issue. Her death warrant is signed, and then you go on in and take this huge country known as India, just as at the time of the John Kennedy assassination. When you have a coup and you take all of America, you set up people like Bobby Kennedy investigating organized crime, or John Kennedy aborting the Bay of Pigs invasion, and assure his murder a vengeance murder to conceal a long-range plan to take control of American policy. All of this has been done before, and I'll get more to Mrs. Gandhi and the specifics in a moment. Now, I usually begin the program with what happened this time last year or 2 years ago, but there are so many items that pertain to what we were sharing on the radio last year and 2 years ago, current in the news today, bubbling over today, and leading to Mrs. Gandhi, that I'm going to spend a great deal of time, or just mention them to you now, and take each one of these items that is current, not what we talked about last year, the year before, but the current article. In the next weeks, I'll be going into the details, but I want to mention the topics. In November, the first week of November of 1982, 2 years back, there were three main areas that I was hitting at. One was Edwin Wilson and George Bush, Task Force 157, and the CIA murders. The assassination teams, and Bush was director of the CIA only a year and 3 months, but he had a very heavy role in particular murders and assassinations that took place when he was CIA director. And in November of 82, I was talking about that. Now, in April of 1984, George Bush made a visit to India and aggravated Prime Minister Indira Gandhi, making these deals or bargains that I'm going into detail with you in a little while. In June 84, Counter Spy magazine came out with an article by John Kelly on the scandal that I haven't had time to cover yet on this program, on Ronald Rewald and the CIA offices in Hawaii and their influences in many countries. And this article on Rewald goes into, briefly mentions the holy money that was sent to India, the India funds, to not only destabilize India, but for cash flight capital to come out of India, I guess knowing that the CIA is getting ready to destabilize it, similar to what Hitler and the Japanese emperor did and the powers that be in Europe. They took the flight capital out so they could use it later, or Trujillo took his money to Swiss banks and Perón took their money to Swiss banks. The flight capital was to be taken out of India and put into American banks by way of the CIA. So while they're destabilizing, they are removing the cash. The country can't ever build itself if you don't have capital there or people investing in their own country or caring about their own country. And we've seen the pattern of these dictatorships working with Hitler, working with the United States, where when they know that the system's going to come apart, the leaders can either be killed or step aside, and those people controlling the purse and the banks have their money somewhere else. So the Counterspy article briefly goes into, and I'll do more, on the Indian funds and how the role of the CIA. In October of 1984, this last month, Jack Anderson has connections which he's bringing up between George Bush, when he was CIA director from 1976, 1977, with Mr. Rewald, Ronald Rewald, R-E-W-A-L-D, and the links. So Bush is active with Rewald. Rewald is putting money into the ashrams and the holy temples in India. Of course, not identifying the showed article. Bush is there just before Mrs. Gandhi is provoked by the situation in the Golden Temple. And just a year ago, 2 years ago, was talking about the role of Bush and Edwin Wilson and that task force that Henry Kissinger was their boss. And, of course, Kissinger runs the Pakistan operation with Mr. Zia. He helped plan the murder of Bhutto and put in Zia, who's now arming to the hilt and arming the Golden Temple for the Sikhs to aggravate Mrs. Gandhi, to shape her up. So Kissinger was the boss of Edwin Wilson and Robert Keith Gray in Task Force 157, Gray's office representing and close to Paul Laxalt and William Casey and so forth. And 2 years ago I was talking about that. Secondly, I was talking on that broadcast about SS Major Friedrich Burkhard and SS Brigadier General Franz A. Six, S-I-X, and how the Green Berets were patterned after the Hitler armies, the special armies, that were the Nazi troops, and they formed the Green Berets in North Carolina, patterned after Hitler's troops, and very active in the special operations, taking over from the regular army, an army behind the army that can do the dirty work and the killing. And when Congress says you can't have a war, then the special forces come in and make the war. And Ronald Reagan lauds what he calls the freedom fighters, who were brought here from Nazi Germany to set up a special operation to do what the established congressmen won't allow. And this is what happened in Nicaragua with the troops discovered there, the CIA troops, in the booklets. Now, in the newspaper, just the past few weeks, and for many, many articles, I didn't realize how many till I stacked them all up, there were reports of that CIA manual that turned out to go back not just to Nicaragua, back to South Vietnam, and the war in Southeast Asia. A story in the newspaper how the Green Berets were formed by in Fort Bragg, and their operations employ this manual. The manual, I'm sure they have many of them, on how to neutralize, how to kill, how to hire criminals, how to assassinate public officials, how to make martyrs of your own team. Well, the newspaper this week had the story of this booklet coming back just this past week to the special forces that I talked about 2 years ago, that this is standard operating procedure, and is again, Reagan calls that the freedom fighters. 2 years ago, I was talking about Michael Ledeen, the propagandist from the Georgetown Center of Strategic Studies, and his connections to Licio Gelli, the Nazi Gestapo leader of Mussolini's, the equivalent of the Gestapo, the secret police, the police force of Mussolini. And Licio Gelli is the man who tried to have coups, many coups, in Italy, part of the P2 operation, the Masonic Lodge, who fled to Argentina. And the relationship of Michael Ledeen from Georgetown and Claire Sterling, particularly Michael Ledeen, down to Licio Gelli. And in the past year, there have been documents of the relationship of the P2 to Ronald Reagan's administration. We've talked about that. Gelli attending his inauguration, and through Michael Sindona with Richard Nixon. Now, the Michael Ledeen connections that I talked about 2 years ago come in the news again in the last few weeks in several forms. One is an article from People's World, November 3rd, 1984, that I will share with you soon at great length. It's by Carl Blois, and it's about the connections of Claire Sterling and Michael Ledeen to a man named Paul Bernard Hentze, H-E-N-Z-E. He was the former station chief in Turkey from 1958 to 1959 from the CIA, and from 1974 to 1977 when George Bush was his boss. And he worked with Agca in Turkey. Agca was from the Grey Wolves, the Nazi mafia connections, the neo-fascist connections. And after Agca murdered a journalist in Turkey, he asked the CIA, what is my next assignment? And he was released from jail and given large amounts of money and ends up in front of the Vatican, where he takes some shots at Pope John Paul II. Now, this is important because they have twisted for several years this story about the plans of the Bulgarians to kill the Pope. The original intention, of course, was to get a holy war where the Antichrist, the Bulgarian, shoots at this holy man, and the whole thing has been strung together with coaching by Claire Sterling and Ledeen and this CIA person, Paul Bernard Hentz. He and Claire Sterling have written books on the shooting of the Pope. Now, the People's World has the connections of the station chief in Turkey, and again, he worked under George Bush. Another article in the San Francisco Chronicle, November the 4th, yesterday, on how the judge is dropping the charges, the allegations pushed by Claire Sterling and Ledeen that Agca also wanted to kill Lech Walesa. The article says Agca admitted he lied about the alleged plot to kill Walesa, and while the judge is saying he admitted he lied, Claire Sterling is on Good Morning America with David Hartman and other television shows, and I'm sure radio all around the country, pushing her book and Hentz's book on the Bulgarian plot, the communist plot, to kill the Pope, the Antichrist, killing the holy man. And the judge is throwing out part of this because it's a total lie, and 50% of the defendants in this case are Nazi mafia Grey Wolves, and then they throw in a few Bulgarians for the getaway. It'll be interesting to see how that develops. But again, this is the Cold War, this 1984, and I was talking about it in 1982 with their links going back to Licio Gelli and the Nazis. Another story this past week, October 23rd, 1984, had to do with the anniversary of the Grenada invasion. And I've mentioned this before. Michael Ledeen, the senior fellow at Georgetown University Center for Strategic and International Studies, has 35,000 pounds of papers of Maurice Bishop, and his name is everywhere in the news, deciding on the communist part of Maurice Bishop. Not Bishop going to William Clark and the National Security Council and wanting to get along with the United States, being forced to work with the Soviet Union because we won't get them a nickel for an airport where we're now putting in $60 or $70 million into Grenada and controlling the entire country. So Ledeen's name was mentioned many times through the years, but 2 years ago this week, and he is a part with Claire Sterling of the Agca story, which is a total lie, and with the disinformation on how dangerous Grenada was under Maurice Bishop. Now, it was a year ago. Those three were 2 years ago. A year ago, I was talking about the long plans for the Grenada assassination in Central America and the use of the CIA in 1980, the murder of Walter Rodney in Guyana, the attempted murder of Grenada's Prime Minister Bishop in June of 1980. 3 years later, they got him. The CIA murder in the Philippines of Claro M. Recto, who was running against Marcos. You hear a lot about Benigno Aquino, but not much about Mr. Recto, a formidable opponent, not handpicked by the CIA. They liked Mr. Aquino to stir up problems there. He was handpicked and actually worked for the CIA. And then I talked about the preparations for the taking of Grenada and the murder of Orlando Letelier and Ronnie Moffat, and that was under the direction of CIA Director George Bush. I was talking last year about the importance of the military getting their clout down there in Central America, taking the invasion to scare all the other countries, Nicaragua or any of those that want to go off on their own. We pretty much control Costa Rica and El Salvador, but we could invade Cuba and Nicaragua, and I was talking about that just 1 year ago now. And in that time, I explained in the past year about Grenada, how from 1979, when the coup was being planned, Sir Eric Gary had come to the United States, how it took several years to arrange the murder of Mr. Maurice Bishop, and now Sir Eric Gairy is ready to come back and take over the government of Grenada. Now, that was the major political leader of 1983, Maurice Bishop. This year, in 1984, it's Indira Gandhi. Next year, it will either be the Prime Minister of New Zealand or Mr. Papandreou from Greece, or the President of Mexico, who won't go along with our Contadora. You wait and see, and within a very few months, save your articles on Greece, New Zealand, and Mexico, and you'll know the hit for 1985, the next country that we're going to overthrow. We have a very good time schedule, and it's very easy to figure out which way they're moving if you carefully read the newspapers. There was a movie on Channel 9 this week out here on public broadcasting on the history of Reinhard Gehlen. And they were saying Reinhard Gehlen, for those of you who don't know, was the chief of the Eastern Intelligence for Adolf Hitler and then came to this country to form the CIA. And what they were saying on the program was that 90% of all the information Reinhard Gehlen had, and the BND, the German intelligence, and evidently the CIA, comes from reading the newspapers, that they can pick up their information. And the same goes for us. If you read your newspapers properly, as you know I have done, and share it with you, you can then see the next step, because it is all in the paper, not only as a source of a so-called news story, but they want to give a message to their teams on how to operate and where to go. Now, unfortunately, I can't give the source of information I usually do of what was going to happen in India. I can't tell you this because it happened as a social conversation when I was in Los Angeles, but involved a friend of mine who made comments about a particular newspaper person who was changing positions to go to India. And this person in the American media is very high up. And I knew immediately then that we were going to be involved because of the transfer of a particular person, and there may be many others. I knew America would be involved in the middle of India conflict after January. I didn't know what happened now, but I told several people who are interested in preserving the Greek government and a friend whose son-in-law happens to be from India that they can look for trouble in January or right after the elections because of a placement of certain people so strategic that America intends to be there. And it's, people may say, well, that isn't accurate. How can you figure that? I knew by the very piece of information that was passed on to me that India would be in the news, not as soon as I expected, but certainly in the news. So a year ago, I was talking about Grenada. Now we go to today and the past events, the assassination of the year now in October 1984, the assassination team in power in India and not visible. They'll let the factions fight each other. But this is what is going on in India right now, is the role of destabilizing that area and making sure that everyone agreeable with our fleets being there behave the way they should. And I'm sure they can pressure Mrs. Gandhi's son to go along with this. Now, the political murders, before I get to Mrs. Gandhi now, and the news of political murders is everywhere in the news. I mentioned when my first published article, Why Was Martha Mitchell Kidnapped? I said the next book I wanted to write was Murderville, USA. That was in 1972. I could write an encyclopedia now. But I want to run down just a few articles about murders simultaneously with the Gandhi murder to get the framework of what was happening or the things that were in the newspaper, because it's hard to absorb so much information. Even with all my files and cross-filing, I'm sure that you just can't pick it up, put it down, and relate it in any context the way the material is coming out unless you make a hard effort to do it. Now, so I want to run down just a few articles on murders with you and share those now. First was a story that came out in People's World October 20th by Mr. Cooper and a Mr. Allen. Political murders spread, U.S. death squads. I was interested in that because I've never seen, and correct me if I'm wrong, many of you are researchers and journalists and people writing books, taking these broadcasts. Have you ever seen in an American newspaper a headline story suggesting that there are death squads in the United States. I've had this on the air for many, many years, but I'm not familiar with seeing it in the press. Now, these people were writing about two recent murders that happened. One directed from Taiwan. This is a journalist by the name of Henry Liu, L-I-U. He was writing a biography of Chiang, and he was gunned down in San Francisco. Out of Taiwan comes the World Anti-Communist League. General John Singlaub is now chairman of it. He's on the board of Western Goals, and I've done endless hours of the relationship of Western Goals to Los Angeles Police Department and other police departments, but this is particularly in California, so it's timely because of the network of intelligence around here. I'm going to do details on the murder of Henry Liu, and there are suggestions of the direction of him, critical of the regime down there and the son of Chiang, who runs Taiwan, how he was gunned down in San Francisco. The second article is called Vietnam Directs the Murder of Professor Klaske Cooperman, ? K-L-A-S-S-K-E, Cooperman, just like it sounds. He was a professor from Cal State, Fullerton, California. He was killed, allegedly by a student, but the lawyers representing him linked to Watergate, and there's a new article link called Watergate Premier Key Link, and the links to Robert Mardian and the Justice Department to the murder of Cooperman and the defense of the person who killed him. The excuse is that they were taking gun courses and cleaning guns, but this goes right back to Robert Mardian, who at the time of Watergate arrest was active with G. Gordon Liddy and the Justice Department. Mardian was down in the archives in Washington watching the Gestapo pictures of Adolf Hitler. Like Liddy, he was allegedly a person who was interested in Nazism. And now back from Watergate, where he was one of the high-up men in the Justice Department under John Mitchell, there are connections to the murder of a professor at Cal State, and the other is to a writer, a journalist in San Francisco with the links to Taiwan. So that Taiwan and South Korea can have people in this country, just as the Philippines have in this country, who kill people here and get away with it. The point is that the Justice Department lets them off. The death squad is only part of the story. The assassins don't go to jail for life. They're not, most of the time the charges are dropped, and that's the point, is that the killers work with the judicial system and have the approval of the police and of the authorities in California. As a matter of fact, in the case of the journalist in San Francisco, the family has hired an attorney to keep track of the police investigation, that you need an attorney of your own and don't depend on the police. Somebody is getting smart in this country that there are death squads and there are links. The other article that I referred to, the counter-spy article on the Rewald case and the CIA, that article makes the links of Watergate again. A Jack Kandischi, K-I-N-D-I-S-C-H-I, who's station chief in Hawaii, the CIA station chief, who used the cover of Robert Mullen and Company. Well, Robert Mullen and Company is a public relations firm that hired E. Howard Hunt, and works, of course, with William Buckley. They're very, very close. And Douglas Caddy, who formed Young Americans for Freedom with Buckley, headed that public relations firm. He still might, the Robert Mullen. So the CIA station group that were sending money out of India and sending money to the ashrams and the churches is linked through counterspy to Mullen Associates in Washington, D.C., the group that not only gave us the Watergate entry experience at the time of the elections that fouled up the American electoral processes in 1972 and caused a president to resign, but they were part of the cover-up, including the murder of Dorothy Hunt and a lot of other 30 or 40 primary Watergate witnesses. So there are Watergate links to the murder of a professor in California and Watergate links to a company of the CIA that is channeling funds through their offices into India and out of India that are both associated with George Bush. We'll take a 1-minute break now. This is a long road to Mrs. Gandhi, but it all relates to Mrs. Gandhi and our vice president and the intelligence community and the murdering that is going on. This is Mae Brussell, and this is side 2 of broadcast number 674, November the 5th, 1984. One of the things I was talking about this time last year that I forgot to update for you was that one of the criticisms of the operation in Grenada and keeping the press off was that they were murdering, bombing people over them. They dropped an airplane over the mental hospital, and they lied about the amount of figures who died there. That was what I was saying in 1983. And then the newspapers this week, in the last week, San Francisco Chronicle, October 23rd, casualty issue. Weinberger denies Grenada cover-up. And there is a long article and a lot of material coming out how the United States Army lied about the amount of people dead in Grenada. And this is what I was speaking about a year ago. October 22nd, 1984, San Jose Mercury, Grenada invasion, a military fiasco, the analysts contend. And I've done quite a bit on the cover-up and what they were covering. But a year ago, I was bringing up these subjects, and a year later, or as always, 2 years later, sometimes 3 years later, we get a little more light into the very controversial allegations that I'm making at this particular time or then. This is why subjects like the murder of Mrs. Gandhi are very sensitive now, just as I wrote about the Korean airline. A year from now, you'll see how much went into Pakistan and into the Sikh army, trained by the United States and the CIA, and the provocations that were set up that forced her to move, and then she's automatically killed, and then we come in and take over. Now, Carl Rowan had a syndicated column just last week. It was October the 20th, a week and a half ago, in the Washington Post, the Monterey Herald. The main title is "The Word Neutralize is Well Understood in U.S. Intelligence Communities." And Carl Rowan is a black writer. He's on the Gronsky program on Sundays, very glib and seems to be bright enough. And he's telling about his discussion with William Sullivan of Division 5 of the FBI, not J. Edgar Hoover, it was William Sullivan, before Sullivan was killed in November 1977. And he explained to Rowan that neutralize is to get rid of and to assassinate. And Rowan is talking about the CIA documents that we're using in Nicaragua and how similarly the same information was used against the Reverend Martin Luther King. And he cites from December 23rd, 1963, the J. Edgar Hoover memo, "We have to neutralize Dr. Martin Luther King Jr." And then Rowan makes note that we're still using the same booklet and that neutralize meant murder. And that memo from J. Edgar Hoover is exactly 1 month after John Kennedy was assassinated. Their next target was J. Edgar Hoover. Now, it took till 1968 to do it. They have to give James Earl Ray a bona fides. They have to travel him around different countries and down to Mexico and to Canada. And he has a route that hides. He has to leave prison in Missouri and go to Hollywood and Louisiana and Mexico back to confuse the route, to lose track of the killer or the motives. The motive was set 1 month after Kennedy was killed, and the murder was done in 1968. But just as I say, Grenada was planned in 1979 and Maurice Bishop was killed in 1983, the plan to take over India and kill Mrs. Gandhi, I'm sure, began as soon as Ronald Reagan was in office or not before. It doesn't matter whether it's Republican or Democrat, but it helps to have a Republican in because a good share of these neutralizations took place under Eisenhower with Nixon as vice president, and a good share under John Kennedy, too, Patrice Lumumba and DM. And, of course, after John Kennedy was killed, Lyndon Johnson was in, and there was the military coup planned by our government and Vernon Walters down in Brazil. The Pentagon and the decisions for foreign and world policy have a much larger range than Republican or Democrat, and we'll go into that later. But getting back, or maybe in another program, getting back to Carl Rowan and his column this week, he's what I call the crybaby, saying or explaining how Martin Luther King was offed, and he can identify with him now being neutralized when they spell out for him, even as early as 1963, to 1977, what the word means, and he sees John Kennedy killed. But what Carl Rowan doesn't tell you when he's on a Gronsky program and in his syndicated column is that Carl Rowan worked for the United States Information Agency and was very active participant in 1964 of covering up the murder of John Kennedy. 20 years ago or 19 years ago, he was an active person putting into the media the cover to sell to you that Oswald did it alone, Lee Harvey Oswald, to hide the Reinhard Gehlen, the Otto Skorzeny, the Fourth Reich, the John McCloy and Alan Dulles, Chase Manhattan Combine that really participated in the planning and the cover-up and the murder of Kennedy. Now, he prepared a program through U.S. Information Agency, which originally, again, was set up by Reinhard Gehlen and the Nazi intelligence for a Radio Free America and all those operations for propaganda purposes. He prepared a program to sell the Warren Report by way of USIA called Top Secret TV Policy. And I have copies of those documents that I got from the National Archives. He was to reach 550 newsmen the day the Warren Report came out. This was his plan. See, this was planned in July of 64, and the Warren Report wasn't printed. They weren't even finished investigating it in 1964, July. I have memos going back and forth of the top lawyers of the Warren Commission questioning Oswald's activity in the Soviet Union or the role of Jack Ruby, and they weren't sure about hardly any piece of solid evidence while they were working on the report. David Lifton published correspondence of Warren Commission members going back and forth, and I have some from the National Archives that he got from me. The Warren Report came out in 1974. I bought my copy in October of 84. But in July, the U.S. Information Agency was planning how to sell it. Now, what has that got to do with Mrs. Gandhi? Before the gun goes off or before the investigation begins, they have all the stories on what happened. Here's the final word. To question it, you're crazy. And when these murders take place, they are ideas put into your mind that are locked there and hard to erase. Mrs. Gandhi was killed last Tuesday, October 30th, and Wednesday morning I watched the TV, the CBS Morning News, and the moderator there, I forget who it was saying, we hear the KGB did it. I wrote it down and wrote down the hour, and they're planting the idea that why would the Soviet Union want to kill Mrs. Gandhi when she wouldn't squeeze them with the Afghan invasion? She wasn't hurting them. She got along with them. She mistrusted Ronald Reagan and George Bush. The motives for what happens are not important. The media have their answers. So Carl Rowan was making policy arrangements with the USIA. He worked for them, which is the equivalent of the Central Intelligence Agency, as I say, to call in 500 newsmen from 65 countries. And he said, we will, in quotes, brief our clients on the subjects of interest abroad. Those are their clients. The whole world news is brought in to the USIA before they had even hardly, from February to July, they were just into the investigation. From July to September when they went to press, there was all kinds of information coming in of a major conspiracy, but they were planning to sell it and package it before the attorneys had even finished. Rowan said, we will use Chief Justice, that's Earl Warren, whose name is on the commission, to assure that evidence was not under the rug. Now, that was 20 years ago, and here he is on the media acting like an intelligent participant in today's events where he manipulated you 20 years ago, sold you a coup when the country was literally taken over, and lied to you then. Why would you believe him now? Now, there was another article about a planned murder, a gentleman from our State Department, a former official of the AID. His name is Walter Reed Martindale III. He was convicted and found guilty of using his U.S. Foreign Service and diplomatic passport. He was going to London to kill Mr. Al-Fassi, the Arab, the one that used to live in Beverly Hills, who was living in London. But the point about this story that was in the Washington Post October the 11th, 1984, is the witness at the trial was a person who says he planned and conducted 24 assassinations and kidnappings, formerly a officer or in the Marines in Vietnam. He conducted 24 assassinations and kidnappings, and his name is Bruce Sleable, Sleagle, and he was the bodyguard at the Republican National Convention for Jerry Falwell. Get the combination where how murder travels with international diplomatic passports, foreign service. The guy's done 10 killings and kidnappings, and here's the holy leader from the land of the tribulations, the pre-tribulations, the millennium, and so forth. Jerry Falwell, his bodyguard, is a man who's bragging about killing and kidnapping 24 various people. He may kidnap 1 and killed 11. I'd like to know the ratio. Another story having to do with Mrs. Gandhi, and I bring these up because, as I say, maybe we'll do 5 minutes on Gandhi now and an hour next week. But it's very important. In the trial of General Westmoreland against CBS, Washington Post, October 19th, just last week and a half, Westmoreland was told not to inform the media. General Westmoreland was ordered to keep his new data from the news media because it would literally blow the lid off Washington. Do whatever is necessary to keep your figures from being released. Now, we live and depend and vote on the media. The printed media is different than the TV media because otherwise I wouldn't be picking up this information. But here is a top general, and over him was Daniel Graham, the man who is planning, not Daniel Graham, pardon me, General Fritz Kramer, the plans officer of the Pentagon, who's the co-partner in the office in Washington with Daniel Graham of High Frontier and Star Wars. Lying then, how would you get a newspaper man up at space colonies to know what's going on or anywhere, and the Pentagon, again, keeping the troops out of, the newspapers rather, out of Grenada. They couldn't watch the troops because they said they disclosed the body count in Vietnam and they didn't want to have any more Vietnams. So here's Westmoreland saying lie to the media. So how do you get your message across? Well, those are just a few articles about death squads in this country. And now to Indira Gandhi and what's going on in India. Well, how does the United States get their message across? To take our orders or die. Do what we say or die. There's a little sample of that in the newspaper last week in the London Times. Pardon me, it wasn't last week, it was in July in the London Times. George Shultz warns New Zealand on the danger of nuclear ban. This is July 18th in the London Times, 1984. He tells the new incoming Labour government, in quotes, your ports are essential. Forget the nuclear ban. The United States is going to put their submarines and boats in your harbor, and you better not buck us. Does that set the new Prime Minister up? I believe it does. There'll be a coup, a scandal, a blackmail, fix him up in some way and get rid of him, change governments if you don't like his policy. Through dirty tricks, not through any reasoning. We want the whole world because this is the Fourth Reich. We want New Zealand, we want Grenada, and all the time Afghanistan is on the border of the Soviet Union, and that's all we hear about. Another story in the Washington Times, October the 12th, the fragility of alliances is illustrated in New Zealand because David Lang, the new Prime Minister, restated his anti-nuclear stance. Now, if they don't want nuclear weapons around Australia or New Zealand, the alliance will be broken. You take our orders, you take our ships. So watch David Lang be on his way out or be dead or massive money funded to remove him because we have a globe set in front of us and each piece of territory is overthrowing an elected democracy and being put in with the pro-nuclear, let us put your missiles there, let us put our atomic submarines, get ready for the Big Bang. Now that is what is going on in New Zealand. That's the way George Shultz works. Again, the People's World had a long article by Con Hallinan, November the 3rd this week, who ordered the Gandhi hit. And I'm going into details on that article. Very important, talking about Pakistan and the separatists and the CIA. But before we jump to that, November the 3rd, I want to take you, as I often do, chronologically through some of the experiences from April and May up till when Mrs. Gandhi was killed. And we'll do as much as we have time for or briefly cover them, and I'll do more next week. The New Times in May of 1984, the end of April, came out with an article, Lessons from the Washington Mentors. lessons for the Washington mentors. And it was about the determination of Mrs. Gandhi not to give in to George Bush. Well, she doesn't know how lethal they are, and she should have done a little history, and she would know. And this is the article. It's about the Pakistani foreign ministers meeting at the end of May in the United States. The United States is closely aligned to them. They promised political cooperation within the framework of strategic accord, meaning you go along with our strategy and you will get all the weapons you want. That is the framework of what is known as strategic accord that she didn't like. Now, 2 weeks before the meeting of how they're going to take over the area and place United States weapons through South Asia and encircle India and all of her neighbors. 2 weeks before that, there was a meeting in Delhi. George Bush went on his Asian tour, and Bush went to India because there was anxiety over Reagan's foreign policy. Mrs. Gandhi thought the United States was aiming to force the world to think and act as Washington would wish. I don't know where she ever got that idea. And this article has a statement in it. It says, Washington is annoyed by the fact that India remains a blank spot on the American strategic map of the world. There is no direct conflict between the United States and India. The Reagan administration sees our country, according to Mrs. Gandhi, as an obstacle, if not a barrier, to the spread of American influence in the Asian and Pacific region. George Bush set out to teach independent India a lesson, this article says, before his departure from India in April. He admitted that disagreements remain. He said two diametrically opposed world outlooks clashed at the Delhi talks, and he threw up Grenada and Nicaragua and Lebanon as, in quotes, a lesson for the non-aligned countries. So Bush went to India, and Mrs. Gandhi and India chair the non-aligned movement, which has about many, many millions of people in it. Prime Minister Indira Gandhi, according to an article published in May of '84, this was a few months ago, expressed concern over the present aggravation of the world climate. India wants to adhere to their policy of non-alignment. She objected to some states imposing their views on others. In April, Reagan went to China for what he called in China strategic consensus, just as Bush said in Pakistan. And she said this parallels impinging on India's security and interest, because when Reagan went to China, it coincided with the Chinese aggression in Vietnam. After Reagan was in China, Bush was sent to Pakistan, which was ominous for the Indian-Pakistan relations. A few days before Bush's arrival in Delhi, a fire was opened up from Pakistan's side on the Indian border. Pressure was exerted on India, and Bush was told about this by Mrs. Gandhi. China might make nuclear weapons that would be available if Pakistan goes along with them. And Mrs. Gandhi felt, as a Hindu, this would increase the Islamic nuclear terror with the bomb in Pakistan. The Indians doubted Reagan's visit to China was motivated by peace or goodwill. This article said in New Times that there's tensions in South Asia from massive armament of Pakistan by the United States and the policy of surrounding India with a ring of hostile states. Bush said he would modify, in quotes, the U.S. attitude, he told Mrs. Gandhi, and grant aid to India if India modified its stand on the Afghan question. Now, right after Mrs. Gandhi was murdered on the Evans-Novak program on CNN, I believe, I forget which of the two men was asking a person from India about Mrs. Gandhi's policies, and I believe it was Novak who just pinned him down. I mean, she hadn't been dead maybe 12 hours, and said, why didn't she go along with the United States? As if she's responsible for her death, which is in fact true, because she wouldn't attack the Soviet Union invasion in Afghanistan, and they were sort of justifying her death now because, see what happens. Novak was not that open about it, was kind of subtle, but at the time of mourning, he was attacking this person because Mrs. Gandhi didn't go along with what she should have done, determined in Washington, and that is tantamount to walking a treacherous line. Now, the article in the New Times in May said Vice President Bush said in India that the situation around Afghanistan was a prerequisite to the settlement of differences between our Pentagon and India. And the Indians said that the United States uses Afghanistan as a pretext for involving Pakistan in its Asian strategy. That is very important, and it's stated very well, and you see it over and over again, that the United States uses the Afghan events as a pretext for involving Pakistan in the Asian strategy. This article says this runs counter to the interests of the people in that part of the world. The United States wants to establish U.S. military bases, as I said before, in Bangladesh, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka. Right now, the Mossad, the Israeli army, are supplying Sri Lanka. U.S. wants to press for the right of entry into these waters by its Navy ships and stockpile their arms and ammunition there. This was published right after the George Bush visit and after Reagan's trip to China, where he begins to offer them the nuclear technology they need and align them to help fight the Soviet Union. The article concluded that Indian leadership concluded that the Reagan administration had no intention of changing its South Asia strategy, that the Bush visit was designed to give a facade acceptable to India, that the U.S. is out to move into the Asian Pacific area, that Reagan will establish military and political domination, that there is global anti-Sovietism that is directed against any independent and stable country. And this was published, as I say, after the Bush visit, that global military preparedness will affect India's security and interests, and that's exactly what happened. India now is fractured and torn apart, and their security and interests are not served. You get the money coming from the CIA into the ashrams and temples, and goodness knows where it went, the flight capital going out, and now the factions are left to fend for each other, and Pakistan can be strong, and they can arm the Sikhs, and other factions surrounding them will be armed heavily. This story went on that said that Pakistan has 10,000 servicemen that they could unleash anytime they want to send into the Indian subcontinent if it's in the national security of the United States, that there's not too many Muslims taking over. They don't want another Khomeini. And as long as they can keep control. Otherwise, our well-funded Mr. Zia, who was put in there when we murdered Mr. Bhutto, and we put in the drug dealer of the world, #1 drug dealer, Zia, he will always come. And that they said that the United States-Chinese agreement on defense and intelligence information using satellites directly affected India's security. By May, they were very insecure of what Ronald Reagan had offered China to spy on India also. Now, that was in May of 1984. In June, on June 1st, 2nd, and 3rd, the Sikhs said they would blockade the roads and have a state of non-cooperation. And I have a lot of information sent to me just before the murder of Mrs. Gandhi, incidentally, on the struggle of the Sikhs and the turmoil going on in India. I'm not saying there wasn't turmoil there, but interestingly enough, I called this friend after Mrs. Gandhi was killed because her son is living over there, a young child, actually a young adult, and wondered if he was safe and what were her feelings about what was going on. And her first remark to me was the KGB did it. It reminded me of CBS, the KGB. And I said, well, why would the Soviet Union want to shoot Mrs. Gandhi, who's a friend? And my friend said, that's a good question. Always look for the motive. Don't come up with the answer. Look to see who gains, and you get a little idea. Now, the struggle between the Sikhs is a long struggle. They had helped Mrs. Gandhi. They had helped the armies in India. They were loyal to India. They are part of the security force, the best that India has. They control the buses, the transportation, the farming of the Punjab, and they wanted a separate state. They were told or led to believe that they would have a separate state, which didn't come about, and so the promise was not kept. And the CIA could find a way to funnel money to people who had been betrayed, and they had indeed been betrayed. But you pick the factions to fight against each other. It's not a question of coaxing Mrs. Gandhi to let them have this little piece of land. It's not so little, it's huge land mass and very rich area, but you don't coax them to get along so that we have less tension in the world. You feed the differences because the Punjab still isn't India, and India covers all the oceans around it, and the Punjab is isolated. So it's a natural way to needle a huge landmass that is ripe for a takeover, and because of so much poverty and the convoluted religious beliefs, right or wrong, that keep them so poor. America wants the waterways. They don't care about the people. So they take the natural enemy. And at that stage, the Sikhs threaten to cut off the water and that goes down from the Punjab to the neighboring states and blockade the roads and have a state of non-cooperation. So Mrs. Gandhi on June the 6th sent in the armies to the Golden Temple. Now that was the worst mistake. I think she should have sent the armies to where the water was being cut off. I think the Indian army is bigger than the Sikh army, and I think they should have surrounded it. There was enough food in the temple for 1 month, and I think they should have sat there, because there was this spoken rule that anybody who goes into the temple that breaks that sacred chanting will be killed. And that was when her death was signed and sealed, and her sons and members of the family right then and there. So the problem didn't happen in the courtyard. It happened in the military advisors that encouraged her to take that step. Now, one of the survivors of the assassination team has said, I was on the television again, a quick remark that there was a very high-level conspiracy to kill Mrs. Gandhi. I'm sure he'll be beheaded before we know what it is. But it was a high-level conspiracy, and it started again with the advice, just as John Kennedy was told, you have to invade the Bay of Pigs because it was set up by Eisenhower and Nixon and the CIA before you were president. It's on the boards. And he says, okay, we'll go with the Bay of Pigs operation. And then he realizes that it's the wrong thing. And his own conscience, he knows it's wrong, and he pulls back. And as I said earlier, that is the way you get John Kennedy, because then you have an army of anti-Castro Cubans who were betrayed, and both were pitted against each other. The anti-Castro Cubans that were in jail, that died, that thought they were going back to their homeland. You pit the two factions, and the CIA role is history, documented over and over again, and this is exactly what happened in India. The advisor of her military, who said, we'll go into the temple, we'll shoot the temple, was the start of the problem. Now, after that, whoever ran the operation again, she turned in a military state, which doesn't speak well for her. It was the most repressive experience India had ever had, and no news people were allowed in or near. There's been a state of emergency, and a member of the Associated Press who talked about the death tolls, the wire services was, in fact, apprehended. You're not supposed to tell it. Not having the news there in June of 84 is no different than not having the news in Grenada, except it lasted a little longer. But no journalists were there. And then, allegedly, there were these caches of drugs and weapons that brought in from Pakistan to make money for the terror the Sikhs could continue against India. And Pakistan, again, wasn't neutral. The Los Angeles Times has a story, June 15th, 1984, hordes of drugs, foreign cash found in the temple, huge amount of heroin, hashish, foreign currency, smuggle the drugs into there, and the narcotics would buy the weapons. And June 16th, 1984 was a front-page story from the New York Times. India implicates the CIA in the Sikh unrest. Prime Minister Indira Gandhi's government keeps insisting that certain foreign powers, and you know who they were, are destabilizing India by having a hand in the Punjab, that the CIA masterminded a plan for Pakistan to send weapons to the followers of Jarnail Singh Bhindranwale, who was murdered there, and got the action going. Well, time is up now is the long introduction to the role of our intelligence in past murders, current murders, and what's in the news now, to relate it to what's going on in India. It's a complicated subject to just begin. The CIA killed Mrs. Gandhi. You have to know how many places they're active, how broad they're working, how they cover up the death tolls, and fund the money into these countries to both destabilize it and reserve the capital for the very rich. I'll do more on Mrs. Gandhi next week, as I say, a long introduction to Gandhi, but not separate from her, because our vice president, elected now for 4 more years and can push himself as president and stay in, and they can off Reagan and make him sick or whatever you want anytime, was very active and part of the Rewald group that had their finger in India and in Chile and worked with the assassination teams, the CIA assassination teams. I've charged them of that many, many times, and I stick by that. We'll be back together next week. This is Mae Brussell. It's KAZU-FM in Pacific Grove, California.